In a quiet corner of the animal shelter, there was a tiny, special cat named Charlie. He was always crying, constantly grieving for his former owner. His family, heartbroken, had brought Charlie here, unaware of how agonizingly the cat suffered at night. Then one day, Dr. White, while examining Charlie, noticed something odd on his collar. He leaned in to make out the barely visible engraving, and his eyes widened again. "Oh my gosh," he whispered quickly. In that instant, he made a call, and his assistant, Emma, burst into the office. She looked at Dr. White, then at Charlie, who was still curled up in the darkest corner. "Wait, are you sure the woman who brought him in said their last name was Carter?" Scott asked, frowning, glancing from Emma to the cat. "Yes." She introduced herself as Grace and called the cat Francis. But the carved letters on the tag didn't say that, and Scott looked puzzled. Since Charlie had arrived at the shelter, his condition had been unstable. Everyone around understood that he was in deep distress. Grace Carter, the widow of the deceased owner, had brought the cat in, lamenting that Charlie only listened to Francis. Charlie's family had tried very hard to care for him, but they had no choice but to leave the pet here. "If things work out, we'll come back for him," Grace said, wiping away tears as she left the shelter. Scott carried Charlie to the kennel, noticing how he curled up against the wall, making the same quiet, plaintive sounds. Although sadness in shelter animals is not uncommon, Charlie's grief seemed immeasurable. Scott had never seen anything like it. "See you later, Charlie," he tossed to Emma later, still pondering the strange feeling he'd had when he came across the cat, who was hiding his face under his paws. When Scott knelt down, his gaze fell on the collar still around Charlie's neck. "Looks like it's time to take it off," he said softly and cautiously reached out. But unexpectedly, Charlie meowed loudly and jumped back, hissing at Scott and causing him to freeze with his hands raised. "Won't you let me take your collar off?" flashed through his mind like an unspoken plea. Scott caught a glimpse of the inscription on the tag and felt a surge of confusion. It must be my imagination, he thought, but his intuition whispered that something wasn't right. Sensing this, Scott moved a little closer. "Okay," he breathed almost inaudibly, reaching out again. Charlie's eyes narrowed, and in an instant he lashed out with his paw, menacingly extending his claws. Scott, realizing that force wouldn't work, backed away. Anxiety mixed with stubborn determination beat distinctly in his chest, and soon he left the kennel. Seeking a fresh approach to the problem, Scott realized Charlie wasn't just grieving, he was holding on to something. Just a few minutes later, Scott returned to the cage, bringing treats and a toy. "Let's try again, buddy," he said gently, placing a treat by the doorway and stepping back to a safe distance. The cat visibly hesitated, but still sniffed the treat, and when he cautiously took it, Scott inwardly rejoiced. While Charlie was chewing, Scott quietly shared his own memories about a pet he had loved. Gradually, the cat calmed down a bit and stopped tucking his paws in so convulsively. Gaining courage, Scott made another attempt, more confidently this time. Charlie remained wary, but a trusting connection began to form between them. Using another treat, Scott gently lifted the cat's head to get a better look at the tag, and suddenly his heart skipped a beat. "Oh God!" he gasped, discovering the engraved name. It was completely different from what he expected and turned his assumptions upside down at once. "Emma, could you come here for a sec?" Scott called, impatience in his voice. The assistant, sensing the tension, appeared immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked with a worried voice, looking from Scott to Charlie. Scott pointed to the collar, as if saying that what was written there should turn everything upside down. Deep down, he felt the mystery thickening, growing with new questions. "Emma, do you have all the information on Grace? Are we 100% sure their last name is Carter?" Scott bombarded her with questions, his thoughts racing ahead. The assistant raised her eyebrows in surprise, confused. "I need to check the records." "Did something happen?" she asked, noticing how agitated Scott was. "The tag I saw doesn't have that name on it," he muttered, clearly bewildered. "And I don't understand why." Emma frowned and, realizing that something serious was going on, nodded briefly. "I'll check right now." With these words, she quickly left to find the documents. While Emma was looking for the necessary information, Scott looked again at the worn letters on the hopelessly worn tag. Every time he tried to decipher it, Charlie would get distracted by either a treat or an attempt to hide. Frustration grew. It seemed that the key to the whole mystery was hidden in this very collar, but it stubbornly refused to reveal itself. A little later, Emma returned holding a thick folder. Here they are. It clearly states Grace, Elizabeth Carter, Mason and Francis, Antonio's Carters, she confirmed, and Scott suddenly felt dizzy. But if that's true, why is a completely different name on the tag? As if trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, he couldn't find a logical explanation. Looking at Charlie, who seemed to be deliberately guarding the collar, Scott realized there was no point in taking it by force. With a sigh, he carefully closed Charlie's cage. However, his heart and mind refused to let go of the inconsistencies. Sitting down at his desk, Scott unfolded all the records about Charlie, trying to extract at least a grain of information. Among the old notes and medical visits, one thing stood out. The cat had been patient for 6 years, but in Scott's opinion, he was at least 10 years old. New questions arose. Who was he before? Who cared for him in the distant past? And why would someone cross out the name on his tag? The only obvious way out was to go to the Carter residence address and look for answers there. Gathering his thoughts, Scott informed Emma and Sarah that he would be leaving the shelter for a while. Taking what he needed, he set off, promising to call if he found out anything important. No one was surprised by this impulse. Everyone was used to his desire to get to the bottom of things. Scott entered Grace's address into the navigator, but anxious thoughts about the solution did not leave him even on the road. What if Charlie was part of something bigger, he thought. And what if this collar was erased on purpose, for some unknown reason? Excuse me for interrupting, but before we continue our story, I urge you to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your support is extremely important. Thank you very much. With exactly these words, he pressed the gas pedal a little harder. Curiosity tormented him and pulled him forward like a magnet, because thoughts of Charlie wouldn't leave his head. Soon Scott stopped at the impressive Carter house, immersing himself in the oppressive silence that reigned around the mansion. He parked the car, took a deep breath, and boldly headed towards the massive front door. Knocking, he said, trying to speak confidently. Grace, it's about the cat Charlie. I need to discuss something important with you. A woman appeared on the doorstep who looked at him with curiosity and noticeable excitement. Oh, Mom's not home right now, she replied, then added, but maybe I can help you. Scott paused briefly, wondering if he should trust the stranger. Would you mind if we looked through old family photos from the past 6 years? Maybe there are mentions of Charlie there, he blurted out. The woman's name was Jane. She was slightly surprised by the request, but gestured for Scott to come inside. It sounds a bit strange, but let's try, she remarked, going upstairs to look for albums. Left alone in the spacious hall, Scott examined the rich interior details with keen interest, feeling that the old walls seemed to whisper their secrets. His attention was drawn to a formal portrait depicting Francis Carter. The eyes in the painting seemed to follow the guest with undisguised scrutiny. Nearby, Scott saw a photograph where Grace and Francis posed embracing, and between them, Charlie was comfortably nestled, still with the same collar around his neck. Scott leaned in, trying to make out the letters on the tag, which were much clearer in the frame. However, this name did not match either Grace or Francis. Scott felt confusion creep back into his soul. At that moment, Jane came down from upstairs, holding an album. Unskrywaемый interest was read in her eyes. Why are you so interested in this particular photo? She asked. Scott hesitated, deciding what to answer. Try to lie? But he chose honesty. I'm trying to get to the bottom of Charlie's mystery, especially after Francis's passing, he said trustingly. And immediately, the wariness disappeared from Jane's face, and sadness showed through her features. My dad found Charlie after he was hit by a car. The cat was so scared that he wouldn't let anyone near him for a long time, she confessed with a sigh. Scott listened intently, going through pictures of the past. It turned out that Charlie had lived with them for 6 years, while seeming much older. Scott understood. It wasn't that simple. Flipping through the pages of the album, Scott finally noticed earlier photos of the cat, even before he became part of the Carter family. Has he always had this collar? Scott brought the picture closer to his eyes. It looks unusual. Jane just shook her head. No, Dad found it already on the cat when he came to. In one of the oldest photos, the letters on the tag were a little clearer. Scott felt his heart beat faster. Perhaps the real owner of Charlie was encrypted here. Can I take this photo with me? Maybe it will help clarify something important, he asked. Jane agreed, although she looked a little confused. Upon returning to the clinic, Scott laid out the photo in front of him and called Emma and Sarah. Look, the name Emily Harrington is clearly visible here, he said, pointing to the picture. He managed to find a woman with that name on the internet, a resident of a neighboring town. Scott excitedly dialed her number. I think I found your missing cat, Katie, he said cautiously. Emily listened in complete bewilderment, her heart pounding, ready to burst out of her chest. You... really? She asked again. Have you found Charlie? Looks like it. Scott nodded. Come to our clinic to see for yourself. Trying to speak calmly, he nevertheless barely restrained his excitement. Emily, still stunned, barely found the strength to agree. Yes, of course, I will. While she was driving, her thoughts returned to the day Charlie disappeared. Years of searching, agonizing experiences. And now, hope flared up again inside her. Scott led her down a long corridor, smelling of antiseptics and cat fur, and stopped in front of a small enclosure. There, curled up tightly, sat a grayish tabby cat with bright green eyes. Seeing a stranger, he let out a sharp defensive sound. How many times has he done that when he was scared? Flashed through Emily's mind, and she shuddered, recognizing this signature hiss. Scott stepped aside a little, giving her the opportunity to speak to Charlie herself. The cat initially tensed up even more, but, as if hearing an echo of past affection, cautiously tilted his head and looked intently at Emily. She extended her hand, palm open, a gesture almost pleading. The space between them was filled with silence, mixed with exciting feelings. Suddenly, he twitched his tail, and a quiet purr escaped from somewhere deep inside. Emily gasped. The kitty cautiously reached out to her, nuzzled his forehead into her palm, and rubbed against her hand, giving her that very warm feeling that she no longer dared to dream of. Scott, standing nearby, felt a lump in his throat, seeing Emily caressing Charlie, as if afraid that the wonderful vision would dissipate if she blinked even once. Emily remembered how she lost Charlie 6 years ago during a difficult period in her life, when she was moving and experiencing endless stress. The cat seemed to dissolve into thin air then, but now he was found. At this moment, the door opened slightly, and footsteps were heard. It was an assistant named Sarah. Grace Carter is here, she announced, looking excited. Scott glanced at her, raising his eyebrows. Sarah nodded in response, peering at Scott and noticing that Emily had frozen in place, still trying to calm her breathing. I'll be back soon, he whispered to Emily, slipping out of the kennel. In the reception area, Scott found Grace Carter standing at the reception desk. She timidly intertwined her fingers, as if afraid to look up. I heard you found the cat. Her voice sounded firm, but clearly betrayed uncertainty. Scott nodded. Yes, we found him. Grace mustered her courage. Is it him? Charlie? At that very moment, Emily approached and quietly stood behind Scott. Her eyes met Grace's, filling the air with silent dialogue. A difficult conversation ensued. Emily told how she had suffered all these 6 years, desperately searching for a cat that seemed to disappear without a trace. Grace quietly, but resolutely, told how she and her husband had once picked up a wounded Charlie, nursed him back to health, and loved him with all their hearts. Gradually, the tension subsided. The women realized that there was no malice between them, only a shared love for the same cat. Each tried to respect the other's feelings. Finally, Grace said, I guess Charlie always had 2 families, didn't he? Emily blinked, raising her eyes, and barely audibly exhaled. Yes, I guess that's how it is. They thought for a long time about the best course of action and in the end came to a decision that they both considered right. Charlie would have 2 homes, 2 loving families, and as much care as he could accept. Scott, watching this example of magnanimity with bated breath, felt a quiet joy. Charlie's journey had finally come full circle, proving that sometimes love can be multiplied without choosing a single side. Did you like this story? Do you agree that Charlie decided to share his love with everyone at once? Write your impressions in the comments if this story touched you. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. It's wonderful that we are able to share our love for animals together, giving them warmth and support. Do you agree that Charlie adores the people who care for him? I think so. Thank you for your time. See you in the next videos. Have a good day and more wonderful stories.